It's pretty rare to see a TV show successfully pull off a late-stage villain introduction, but the truth of the matter is, Stranger Things has done exactly that with their main antagonist, Vecna. A decaying, warped entity that has orchestrated the events of this franchise from the very beginning, Vecna is cruel, calculating, and quite adept at getting what he wants, even if he doesn't get it the way he wants it to go on the first try. He's patient, enjoys the pain of others, and above all, his actor does complete justice to the unsettling nature of his character. Campbell Bower is absolutely fantastic as Vecna, Ozempic waistline jokes be damned, but the one thing that's still unclear about his most iconic role is its history. How did Vecna become Vecna? What's his purpose? And why does he want to destroy humanity so badly? Well, that's what we're going to discuss in this video, so strap on your seatbelts and make sure your backs are well adjusted, because this is going to be a bumpy ride.
Yeah. Like you, I didn't fit in with the other children.
A curious boy who loved nature and aviation. The entity that would come to be known as Vecna didn't start off life that way. He was born Henry Creel, the son of Victor and Virginia Creel, whose life began in a place called Rachel, Nevada, far away from Hawkins. Henry was born at some time during the final stages of World War II and had a sister called Alice, whom he presumably loved very much when he lived in Nevada. The reason there's a lot of confusion about Henry's backstory among the Stranger Things fanbase is actually quite simple. He himself doesn't seem to know his true history. When he's introduced as Vecna, he gives us a version of events that paints him as always having been a sadistic psychopath. Nancy Wheeler gets a front-row seat to his insanity in Season 4 when he starts stalking the people of Hawkins through their dreams, and she witnesses the horrific acts Vecna committed during his version of his childhood. Part 1 of Season 5 spent quite a bit of time establishing the fact that, despite being extremely powerful, Henry was a man with a broken mind. In fact, his mental state was so fragmented that he had quote-unquote broken memories. These memories represent his true history, but for some reason he doesn't talk about them in his many expositional dialogue exchanges. Yet it's within one of these broken memories that Max finds shelter after her mind is separated from her body and trapped within the Upside Down. This memory is of an event that takes place in a cave system in Rachel, Nevada, and that's how we know it's the same cave that serves as one of the major settings for the only official Stranger Things spin-off property that has the Duffer Brothers' stamp of approval, the stage play called The First Shadow. This play gives us the true backstory of Henry Creel, and it's as dark and disturbing as you'd expect it to be for a character like Vecna, though not nearly as disturbing as his version of events. So now that we've given you guys a setup for the two versions of Vecna's history that exist within the show, let's start things off with the quote-unquote real version. Henry came into this world as part of a family that was doing well for itself and wanted to preserve its connection to nature. His childhood home in Nevada was built near a forest, and Henry had an early interest in being an outdoorsman. He was a part of the Boy Scouts of America, an organization that attempts to make its members happy, healthy, and self-sufficient members of society by exposing them to conditions that require them to essentially fend for themselves. Camping, hiking, and other such activities are quite a common part of the Scouts' way, and these things capture the frontier spirit that Americans have been fascinated with for generations. By learning how to survive in nature, the Scouts become capable of handling themselves both within green and concrete jungles, and so it's a program that aims to bring in holistic development for its participants and encourages lateral thinking. And Henry was the perfect match for such a program because being in nature, exploring things, and solving puzzles were some of the things that gave him the most joy. His parents always called him a sensitive kid who had difficulties adjusting to his peers, and that's often chalked up as the first sign of his eventual madness. But we think that just refers to Henry's unique mind, which was capable of breaking simple to intermediate codes and ciphers before the age of 8. He was a massive fan of Captain Midnight, a radio adventure series that featured a retired World War I fighter pilot / private security contractor as its protagonist, and you'll be able to tell just how influenced Henry was by this guy in a few minutes. For now, though, we'll just say that he was such a big Captain Midnight fan that his spyglass, which has become iconic at this point in the series' lifetime, was Captain Midnight themed. So a kid who was in tune with his feelings, was highly intelligent, and loved spending time in the woods near his home as opposed to going out and playing with his peers from the same age group. Henry just sounds like a maladjusted yet rather normal kid with parents who didn't recognize just how much brains he had, right? We know that if he were our child, we'd have encouraged his interests to the moon and beyond, so one day he could become a ranger at a national reserve or something. He had the interest and demonstrable skills for it, and his parents, though troubled by his social skills, didn't seem to resent him or be terrified of him at first. So what exactly happened that turned this promising young man into the monster we know today? Well, the big change. Henry's first visit to Dimension X. Sometime around his 8th birthday, young Henry's love for exploration would change his life forever. While out in the woods with his spyglass, he spotted some unusual activity in a nearby cave system. When he went exploring, he found a Soviet spy hiding there with some rather heavy-duty equipment. The fan transcripts of the first shadow tell us that Henry somehow activated the machine and ended up becoming the second human being to be transported to, and survive, the alternate dimension that the US government discovered accidentally just over a decade before. Turns out, he'd interacted with the machine that the government had developed in order to access that dimension again because they wanted to explore the full impact of it on the human population and assess the potential of weaponizing it against the United States' enemies. The Philadelphia experiment, which is one of the most popular conspiracy theories in the history of conspiracy theories, talks about how the U.S. Navy accidentally teleported the USS Eldridge to another part of the States for a few minutes before it returned to its original location. This sparked all kinds of debate about whether teleportation and interdimensional travel, as well as time travel, would be possible in our world. Stranger Things took that idea and made it canon by making its Philadelphia experiment actually transport the USS Eldridge to Dimension X, which is where humanity first made contact with the beings we now know as the Demogorgons and the Mind Flayer. The only survivor of that little experiment was rendered catatonic, but there were interesting changes in his physiology, like the fact that his blood type had changed to something that can't be found in or even synthesized by human hands. To explore the complete effects of exposure to another dimension, the government established the Nevada Project and made that survivor's son its project head, which is where Martin Brenner comes into the picture. We'll talk about him in a bit, but that's basically the setup for what young Henry encountered when he went into that cave system to explore what or who was in there. In our heads, the reason he activated that machine despite not knowing anything else about it is because he used his code-breaking skills to essentially hack into it. That feels like a massive stretch because the machine was stolen by a literal spy, and spies' entire lives are encoded and encrypted, but the first shadow portrays Henry as this prodigy in the making who's broken by the experience he has that day. Henry doesn't remember this consciously during the speech he gives to Eleven in Season 4. The first time he meets the Mind Flayer is on this day, not after spending several years refining his powers. We say this with confidence because, like Will Byers at the beginning of the show, Henry too disappeared for several hours after activating the dimension-traveling device, and when he came back, he just wasn't the same person anymore. This is where the version of events that the play gives us and the version of events Henry himself gives us start aligning a little bit, because it is true that strange things start happening within his vicinity and within Henry himself. The reason his family gives to the world for moving from a small town in Nevada to a small town in Indiana was that Henry's mom had an uncle who recently passed away and left her a small fortune to inherit. But the true reason was Henry lashing out at one of his friends and unconsciously using his newfound powers to paralyze him, just like how Martin's dad was paralyzed by his experience in Dimension X and how Eleven's mom was rendered comatose in the main timeline of Stranger Things. Henry's parents must have realized that something major happened to their son during his time in that cave because he came back without his favorite spyglass, which was quite unlike Henry. And in Season 5, Part 1, Max realizes the same thing. Only she hasn't seen the first shadow, so she doesn't know exactly what happened. But we do, thanks to fans, and what happened to Henry is quite simple. On that day, he came under the influence of an entity that cannot be perceived by the human mind as having a definite form, and that entity is whom we recognize as the Mind Flayer in later seasons of Stranger Things. In the show, Henry tells Eleven that he discovered his powers from scratch, and that's what makes him unique because he could do so many things, like killing animals with his telepathic powers or giving his parents nightmarish visions based on their personal fears. In the play, Henry isn't the one in control of these actions. The entity that entered his body while he was in Dimension X is, and that entity, based on everything we've seen, can only be the Mind Flayer. So when Henry tells Eleven that he hates how humans live lives based on things like minutes, hours, days, months, and years, and when he expresses disgust at their cyclical lives where they feed, reproduce, die, and repeat the process all over again, that isn't just him talking, that's the Mind Flayer talking through him. We'll talk more about what that means for Vecna in a few minutes. Make sure you stick around to the end of the video for that. But getting back to the changes in Henry, they're so stark and sudden that it made complete sense for his mom to take him to what she thought was a lab for special kids. The Hawkins Lab had been set up by Martin Brenner to launch Project MKUltra, but its true origin lies in his discovery of Henry. When he went to investigate those caves where the Soviet spy had supposedly stashed his equipment, he also found Henry's spyglass, which pointed him towards the Creels. He must have followed them to Hawkins to realize his vision for a world where the mind itself becomes a weapon, and when young Henry was brought in by his mother for a quote-unquote checkup, it must have felt like a moment of revelation to Brenner. He'd spent so much of his life trying to recreate what happened to his father, and now he had the perfect test subject to realize his own dreams, because unlike Captain Brenner, Henry was still capable of being a functional human being, as disturbed as he was. What convinced Brenner to pursue this kid was the vision he showed him of a Demogorgon, which was made possible via the use of a sensory deprivation tank, something that later becomes a staple of Brenner's MKUltra experiments. Putting Henry into a prototype version of it allowed the kid to enter a space he called the battlefield, which was nothing more than the black void we see Eleven entering when she uses her remote viewing abilities. The reason Henry calls this space the battlefield could be twofold in our opinion. The first is his love for Captain Midnight, who fought several battles as a fighter pilot in World War I. Perhaps this was Henry's way of rationalizing the things he was experiencing, which were totally not normal for any standard human being. The second reason is that this was the space where he found himself struggling against the influence of the Mind Flayer, which would make the battlefield quite literally a field of battle. In the show, Henry claims that he came to despise humanity as he explored his powers on a deeper level, but in the play, he was actually afraid of them, and he even ended up with a girlfriend who might end up making an appearance to reconcile the disconnect between his version of events and the truth. We say this because we've already seen her brother heroically sacrificing himself. That's right, we're talking about Bob Newby, aka Sean Astin's character from Season 2. The story connections and contradictions between Stranger Things' version of Henry Creel's background and the first Shadows version are way too many for us to ignore, so by superimposing the two, we get the actual composite sketch of what's really going on with him. Yes, Henry did do all those things he makes Nancy and 11C in Season 4, but he didn't do it of his own volition. He did it under the influence of the Mind Flayer. It was the Mind Flayer that made him kill his mom and sister after toying with them like he was Freddy Krueger with Pennywise's powers. He also nearly did the same thing to his girlfriend Patty, but she survived, ironically enough, thanks to Martin Brenner's intervention. Brenner took Henry in after the incident at the Creel house and promised him a place where his gifts would be put to good use. But Brenner was also aware of Henry's personality at the time, and that if given the chance, he'd do the exact same thing to him as well. Quite a change from when he first refused to kill a couple of people for Martin to observe the full extent of his powers, but hey, a boy has to adapt to survive, right? Ever since Henry went to Dimension X and came back altered, he'd been surviving through adaptation every day of his life. That all changed the day he attacked his family, because on that day, Henry stopped existing, at least in the way he used to exist. He became Vecna for the first time. This is why we think he agreed to joining Brenner as well, because at that time, Vecna was more interested in figuring out the full extent of his potential. But Martin, being the smart guy he is, knew that he couldn't take in a person as unstable as him without having safeguards in place. He installed a chip called Soteria in his neck, which seems to be made from an exotic material not found anywhere else on Earth, and tattooed the number 1 on Henry's arm. That's how this curious little child went from being a Boy Scout to a psychopathic murderer and a lab rat, as well as the central subject for America's most controversial human experimentation program, Project MKUltra. The whole thing was conceived because of and designed around Henry Creel and his powers. It's in the bowels of the Hawkins Lab that his Vecna persona really started to take shape. The Forgotten One. How Vecna was banished and returned to Stranger Things. If we're being completely honest, we kind of understand why Vecna became as vicious and sadistic as he is. I mean, how would you feel if you were forced to live in a lab for over 2 decades, had your blood drawn and infused into the bodies of people who were supposed to gain your precious telepathic abilities through them, and then were forced to act as an affectionate orderly, and all you really wanted to do was let loose and kill them all? Sure, it's an ego trip to think that way, but Henry Creel was really going through it after he became Brenner's lab rat. He had to watch the test subjects born from Project MKUltra gain all the powers that were dampened for him by the Soteria chip, not just watch them, but in many cases help guide them into realizing their full potential. A total of 18 children were born to the parents that participated in Project MKUltra, and all of them had different aspects of Henry's original abilities. All of them had telekinetic abilities, but their telepathic powers would manifest in different ways. For instance, 8 got the ability to induce lifelike hallucinations, while 11 got the ability of remote viewing. All of these things were things Henry could have done by himself, and much better than these literal children, might we add, so it makes sense that, seeing no way out for himself, he ended up manipulating 11 into helping him out. Henry had always been an observant person, and when he saw that she was being singled out for bullying purposes by the big dogs of Brenner's program, he also saw an opportunity. He befriended Elle by giving her advice and being there for her when no one else was, and when the time was right, he manipulated her into removing his Soteria chip so that he could finally be free of Brenner's control. As soon as that happened, Henry went on a murderous rampage, killing every single person in Hawkins Lab that was associated with Project MK-Ultra. Yes, even the little children. But the one person he couldn't kill was Elle herself, because she had somehow managed to realize her full potential as the Stranger Things version of Jean Grey. After hearing his wicked speech from Season 4, which honestly, hats off to Jamie Campbell Bower for putting in such an amazing performance in what was quite an elaborate expositional piece of writing, Eleven decided that she would stop holding back. When he finally made his move to kill her, she demonstrated a power greater than his and opened a literal hole in the fabric of reality by summoning a gate. This gate swallowed up Henry like a hungry predator's maw, and this is when he and Vecna kind of merge into the same person. We see Henry's body hurtling through the space between Earth and Dimension X as it gets zapped by lightning constantly, burning his body in a way that leaves it permanently disfigured. And then we hear him talking about how he discovered beautiful things in that other place, the vines, the demo beasts, and most importantly, the Mind Flayer. Henry shapes the Mind Flayer into the form of a gigantic arachnid because after moving to Hawkins and unlocking his powers, he became obsessed with Black Widows. Most people fear spiders. They detest them. And yet, post-disappearance, Henry found them endlessly fascinating. More than that, he found a great comfort in the kinship. He believed that, like him, they were solitary creatures and deeply misunderstood. They were gods of our world, the most important of all predators. They immobilize and feed on the weak, bringing balance and order to an unstable ecosystem, and if that doesn't sound exactly like what happened to Captain Brenner and Eleven's mom when they were exposed to Dimension X's influence, we don't know what would. After being banished to the other place, Henry bided his time because he knew that now that Eleven had created one gate, she would soon create another. And his patience paid off in 1983 when Brenner, in an attempt to recreate the same scene Henry had shown him years prior, ended up accidentally creating a gate to what's now known as the Upside Down. That's when Vecna's influence really starts ramping up within the human world, and the rest is something you've already seen, assuming all 4.5 seasons of Stranger Things were on your watch list, of course. But there is something odd about the way Vecna operates in Season 5 as opposed to Season 4, because we originally thought that he was a being of pure evil, but, well, why don't we just tell you guys? The big reveal, the duality of Henry Creel. If you watched the Season 5 trailer closely, or just Season 5 in general, you'd have realized that Henry Creel and Vecna aren't exactly the same person. They're two personalities competing for the same body. How do we know that? Well, it's simple. The show makes a distinction between Vecna and Henry's other persona, Mr. Whatsit. Throughout Season 4, Vecna was hell-bent on ending humanity by merging Earth with the Upside Down. In fact, he kidnapped Will Byers at the beginning of Season 1 precisely for that reason, and also because he probably saw a bit of himself in that kid. Like Henry, Will was kind of an outdoorsy kid, what with Castle Byers being out in the woods around Hawkins. He too was socially awkward, preferring Dungeons & Dragons with his close group of friends over hanging out with other people socially. Had he become a Boy Scout, we'd have called him Henry 2.0 in every aspect, because Vecna's stated reason for targeting Will first was specifically his weakness. Despite being named Will, he was always socially awkward, and he never quite believed in himself, much like young Henry. When Eleven made contact with that Demogorgon, it unleashed the Upside Down's influence upon Earth, and that's exactly what Vecna had been waiting for. He tried multiple different methods to merge the two worlds over the course of 5 seasons. He took the subtle approach in Season 1 when he kidnapped Will and tried to have him create an army of Demogorgons on Earth, whom he'd then use from the Upside Down as his minions. When that didn't work, Hawkins became infested with the vines from the Upside Down that caused crops to rot and decay, allowing demo dogs to run rampant throughout the place. When that plan fails as well, the Mind Flayer itself makes an appearance in Season 3, culminating in that final battle against the disturbing and disgusting blob of human and rat flesh being controlled by the Flayer's influence. And when that also doesn't work out, Vecna decides to involve himself personally, demonstrating his unfathomable powers and inextricable incredible connection to the Upside Down. He literally juices himself up by connecting himself to the vines and drawing on that domain's power. And in Season 5, he's been opening up dimensional portals like he's dropping breadcrumbs for birds to follow. But what's curious is that he's also doing something else. He's sort of rescuing the minds of the kids that he himself has targeted by bringing the most promising of them into his own memoryscape. Our protagonists assumed that just because Holly Wheeler had been kidnapped by someone that matched Henry Creel's description, that she was about to get willed. But the truth is, Holly's fine, at least her psyche is. It's living in the Creel house right now, the one that exists in Henry's memories, and she's even found and decided to escape this memory fragment with Max, whom we learn is still alive, at least mentally speaking. Why would Vecna, an entity that's been hell-bent on destroying Earth and humanity, allow these kids to hang out safely within Henry's mind? Well, turns out Vecna isn't doing that, because Vecna and Whatsit are two different aspects of the same personality. Vecna is the aspect that represents the Mind Flayer's control over Henry Creel, because the way Vecna talks makes him feel like he's not exactly human. His disdain for humanity seems to come from a deeply personal place, and it feels almost alien, like Vecna himself doesn't experience life and time in the cyclical fashion that humanity does. This is one of the main reasons we think he's the Mind Flayer-controlled persona of Henry Creel, because as a disembodied hive-minded entity that can potentially never be destroyed, at least not fully, the Flayer is of course going to hate the fleeting and individualistic nature of human life. Henry thinking he got his powers way later than he actually got them can be explained by thinking of the Mind Flayer particles within him going dormant after humanity stopped creating more gates, which is why Henry's personality changed so much within such a short span of time. But then we also have his Mr. Whatsit persona, and that's a direct reference to one of the best novels of the 20th century, A Wrinkle in Time. In that novel, Whatsit is the name of a spiritual entity that's actually the personification of a dead star, which makes contact with the child protagonists to not only help them save their father, but also stop the spreading of evil throughout the universe, especially the dark entity called the Black Thing. Mrs. Whatsit in Wrinkle of Time is a good person who genuinely wants to help out kids by giving them whatever knowledge or abilities she can, but because our protagonists know Henry is Vecna, they don't see him that way. They think he's using it as a cover to lure more targets into the Upside Down, and that is true of Vecna at least. But Mr. Whatsit is actually working to save them from Vecna because, like we mentioned earlier, his mind has been turned into a battlefield, and this is probably how he's coping with all the changes that have happened to him. People with extremely powerful minds resisting the influence of hive mind entities is quite a common theme in literature, and that's exactly what's happening here as well. When Will Byers' eyes turned the same shade as Vecna's, we knew that something wrong was going to happen to him, and sure enough, both he and Henry became the equivalent of Charles Wallace from A Wrinkle in Time. Heck, when they see through the eyes of Demogorgons, their vision is colored red, and the creature that ends up influencing Charles into becoming the minion of the Black Thing called It, no relation to the works of Stephen King, is simply called the Man with Red Eyes. He's It's mouthpiece and helps spread his malign influence throughout the cosmos, with every planet that comes into contact with the Black Thing turning into a homogenized version of itself where everything and everyone look and act exactly the same. If that isn't ringing any bells for you, then you clearly haven't been paying attention to the Upside Down, so we'll suggest you go watch our video on that to update yourselves. Suffice it to say, we knew that Mr. Whatsit wasn't going to be Vecna's cover for kidnapping children because he does it quickly and more efficiently by just opening up dimensional portals everywhere his targets are. What also makes this whole thing so Wrinkle of Time adjacent is the fact that after everything is said and done in the novel, Mrs. Whatsit returns the protagonist to just before she met them, and now that Henry doesn't have control over his physical body anymore, he's also going to fade away if his consciousness isn't sustained. So yes, calling Henry a crazy person who is way too obsessed with killing his own kind and transforming Earth is a bit of a misalignment because he never wanted those things. The Mind Flayer did. And if A Wrinkle in Time gives us any clues, it's that the Mind Flayer's goal is the complete assimilation of whatever is present on its target planet into itself. Exactly like the Black Thing from Madeleine L'Engle's work. It's ironic that the guy we've been calling the villain for so long actually turned out to be the hero after a fashion, but that's why Stranger Things is so peak. It doesn't just nail aesthetics, it also nails emotional storytelling in a way that we haven't seen done too much as of late, and it all begins and ends with the character of Henry Creel, whose entire life is a warning. Exploration is good, but only when it's done in a way that doesn't put you in harm's way, because when that happens, you become a creepy tree-faced monster yourself, and that's a fate worse than death in our opinion, as poor Henry knows all too well. He lived most of his life thinking he's actually something he isn't, and by the time he started fighting against it, it was already too late for him. But still, the fact that he gets to go out on his own terms is at least a silver lining, if not the rainbow with the pot of gold at the end. Considering everything that's happened throughout this series, we'll take that as a win any day. Conclusion. And that's it for this one. The entire life of Henry Creel, aka Vecna, wasn't an easy one to dissect and present, simply because of the two versions of it that exist in the show's lore. We hope we've done a good job of reconciling both these versions and giving you a comprehensive picture of what his life actually looks like, which is the classic representation of a person opening Pandora's box, regretting it for the rest of their lives. But that's just our opinion. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comment section down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Stranger Things content. We'll see you guys real soon with yet another video, so until then, stay safe, and remember, don't try to decrypt sensitive government data just because you're a prodigious hacker in the making. Unless, of course, going crazy is what you're trying to do, in which case, go ham, my dudes. See you next time.